Have you ever stayed at a hotel where the night never seems to end? That's what happened to Julie and her friends when they checked into the Willow's Edge Inn, a forgotten roadside motel nestled deep in the backwoods. It seemed like a safe enough place to crash for the night, a no-frills, old-fashioned motel. But they didn't care. After hours of driving and getting lost on unfamiliar roads, they just wanted a place to sleep. But what started as a simple overnight stop quickly became a waking nightmare. Julie, Kevin, and Samantha were on a road trip, hoping to make it to a festival in the next state. Their GPS had sent them off the main highway, down winding roads through dense forests, and by the time they realized they were lost, it was too late to turn back. The thick fog that had rolled in made visibility almost zero, and their phones had no signal. That's when they saw the neon sign flickering in the distance. Willow's Edge Inn. Vacancy. The place looked run down, almost abandoned. The old-fashioned design and faded colors suggested it hadn't been renovated since the 70s. But the lights were on, and they were tired. Kevin pulled the car into the gravel lot, which was empty except for one other car, a beat-up sedan that looked like it had been sitting there for years. "This place gives me the creeps," Samantha muttered from the back seat, her eyes darting toward the shadowy trees that surrounded the inn. Julie nodded, but she was too exhausted to care. "It's one night. Let's just get a room and sleep." Inside, the lobby was as outdated as the exterior. A few chairs with cracked leather upholstery, an old rotary phone on the wall, and the faint smell of mildew. A small bell sat on the desk, and when Julie rang it, an unsettling echo filled the empty space. After a few moments, a woman shuffled in from the back. She was thin and frail, with pale skin and hollow eyes, her gray hair tied into a tight bun. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome," the woman said, her voice raspy. "Just passing through?" "Yeah," Kevin said. "One room for the night." The woman didn't ask any questions. She handed them a key to room 12 and gave them a strange smile. "Enjoy your stay," she said, her voice low and soft, like a warning. Julie couldn't help but notice that there were no other keys behind the counter. It was as if room 12 was the only one in use. She felt a chill run down her spine, but brushed it off. They were tired, and the sooner they got some sleep, the better. The room wasn't much better than the lobby. It smelled damp, and the bedspreads were old and faded. The wallpaper was peeling at the edges, and the single window looked out into the thick fog. But it would do for one night. After getting settled in, Kevin turned on the small TV in the corner, but it only played static. "Figures," he muttered. He shut it off, and they all agreed to just get some sleep. Julie woke up in the middle of the night, her heart racing. She wasn't sure what had startled her awake. Maybe a dream, maybe a noise. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand. The red digits blinked 2 a.m., but something was off. The clock was old, but the way the numbers blinked, it seemed like it was frozen in time. She rolled over to see Kevin and Samantha still asleep, but something felt wrong. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and it felt like the walls were closing in. The silence was oppressive, too quiet. No wind, no outside noises, just an eerie stillness. Julie sat up, rubbing her arms to shake off the chill that had crept over her. That's when she heard it. A soft tapping sound, like fingernails brushing against the window. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the foggy glass. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. Slowly, she crept toward the window, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hand trembled as she pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The fog was too thick to see anything. But just as she was about to let the curtain fall back into place, she saw it. A shadow. A figure standing just at the edge of the window, motionless, watching. It was too dark to make out any features, but it was there, looming in the mist. Julie gasped and stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her ears. She rushed to wake Kevin. "There's someone outside." Kevin groggily opened his eyes, blinking in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "I saw someone outside watching us." Samantha stirred, sitting up with a frown. "Are you sure? It's probably just a tree or something." "I know what I saw," Julie insisted, her voice trembling. Kevin got out of bed and walked over to the window, pulling the curtain open wide. "There's nothing out here," he said, staring into the fog. "You're just tired." Julie felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach, but she didn't argue. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was just overtired. She tried to calm her nerves, but something still felt wrong. The air was too still, too heavy. They all went back to bed, but Julie couldn't sleep. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling that same oppressive weight pushing down on her. The clock still blinked 2 a.m. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours, but when Julie glanced at the clock again, it still said 2 a.m. A sense of unease washed over her. How could it still be the same time? She sat up and checked her phone, but it had no signal. No time, no reception, nothing. She shook Kevin awake. "Something's wrong. It's still 2 o'clock. The clock hasn't changed." Kevin, half asleep, groaned. "It's probably broken." But Julie knew it wasn't just the clock. The air, the atmosphere. Everything felt wrong, like they were trapped in a bubble of time that refused to move forward. She got out of bed and opened the door to the hallway. What she saw froze her blood. The hallway outside their room wasn't the same one they had walked down earlier. It stretched on endlessly, the walls warped and twisting, the floor rippling like water. Doors lined the hallway, but they were all crooked, as if the building itself had shifted. And at the far end of the hall, barely visible in the dim light, was the same shadow she had seen outside. A figure, tall and slender, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, its dark eyes fixed on her. Julie slammed the door shut, her hands shaking. "We have to leave. Now!" Kevin and Samantha looked at her in confusion. But when they saw the fear in her eyes, they didn't argue. They grabbed their things and rushed out of the room. But when they stepped into the hallway, they realized they weren't in the same place anymore. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, with no end in sight. The walls were pulsating, almost breathing, and the same shadowy figure loomed at the far end, watching their every move. Panic set in as they ran, trying to find an exit. But no matter how far they ran, they couldn't escape. The walls began to close in, the floor warping beneath their feet, and the oppressive darkness swallowed them whole. The last thing Julie remembered was the cold, icy grip of the figure as it reached for her, pulling her into the endless night. When the authorities arrived the next day, they found the car abandoned in the parking lot, but there was no sign of the three friends. The woman at the front desk simply smiled when questioned, her hollow eyes betraying no emotion. Willow's Edge Inn remained as it always had, a place where time stopped and no one ever checked out. Room 413. The bellhop handed me the key with trembling hands. "Room 413, he whispered, "but I'd reconsider if I were you." Tom wasn't superstitious. He'd stayed at countless motels on his travels for work, and everyone had its quirks. This one seemed no different, save for the nervous energy that permeated the air when his room number was announced. He chalked it up to old legends, nothing more. But room 413 wasn't just another dingy motel room. The moment Tom stepped inside, he felt an icy cold chill that the flickering heater couldn't touch. The walls were lined with strange, almost invisible scratches, and the mirror, cracked in the corner, seemed to distort his reflection, warping his features into something unrecognizable. Every night, at 3:13 a.m., Tom was woken by a soft, rhythmic knocking. At first, he thought it was someone playing a prank, but when he opened the door, no one was there. The knocking persisted, growing louder, more urgent each night. Soon, whispers accompanied the knocks, unintelligible but desperate. One evening, after an unusually intense bout of knocking, Tom finally stayed awake to confront whoever was outside. As the clock hit 3:13 a.m., he watched in horror as the door slowly opened, revealing nothing but a cold, dark hallway. But then, something unseen moved toward him. The air grew heavy, pressing on his chest, suffocating him. Room 413 had claimed another. The vacancy sign. The glowing vacancy sign flickered just as I pulled into the empty parking lot, the neon buzzing ominously in the silent night. Samantha was exhausted from driving all day. When she saw the small, run-down motel with its flickering sign, she figured it was better than falling asleep at the wheel. She checked in with the night clerk, who barely looked up as he handed her the key to room 8. The room was musty, smelling of mildew and stale cigarettes. The lights were dim, and the TV only played static. As she lay down to sleep, she noticed something unsettling. A thick layer of dust coated everything except for the bed. It was as though no one had stayed there for years, but someone had prepared the bed just for her. In the middle of the night, she woke to the sound of soft footsteps outside her door. She listened closely, but the steps stopped. Samantha's heart raced as she sat up, hearing the faintest whisper through the walls. "He's here." Thinking it was just her imagination, she forced herself to sleep again, only to be awakened by a knock on the door. It was slow and deliberate, as though someone knew she was inside, waiting for her to answer. Too terrified to move, Samantha stayed still until morning, only to discover the motel was abandoned. No clerk, no other guests, just her, a flickering vacancy sign, and the unsettling realization that the footsteps never left. Do not disturb. I put the do not disturb sign on the door before going to bed, but when I woke up, it was gone. Alex and his girlfriend, Mia, checked into a small, cheap motel after their car broke down in the middle of nowhere. The room was unremarkable, grungy, but it would do for the night. After a long, tiring day, they hung the do not disturb sign on the door and collapsed into bed. In the middle of the night, Alex woke up to use the bathroom. He noticed the do not disturb sign wasn't on the door handle anymore. Assuming it had just fallen, he went back to bed. The next morning, Mia was gone. Her side of the bed was cold, her things untouched. Panicking, Alex searched the motel, but there was no trace of her anywhere. When he asked the front desk clerk, she simply smiled and said, "You came here alone, sir." Frantic, Alex called the police, but when they arrived, the motel staff insisted no one had checked in with him. There was no record of Mia ever being there. Desperate, Alex went back to the room and ripped it apart, hoping to find some clue. In the closet, scratched into the wood, were the words, "Do not disturb." The room that doesn't exist. When I asked for directions to room 22, the receptionist froze. "There is no room 22, she said. Jake had been driving for hours through a relentless storm. When he found a small motel off the highway, he was grateful for the shelter. The receptionist gave him a key to room 22, but when he asked where it was, her expression darkened. "There is no room 22, she insisted, though the key clearly said otherwise. Confused, Jake wandered the motel until he found a door marked with the number. The door was old and slightly warped, and as he turned the key, he heard a strange clicking sound from inside. The room looked ordinary at first, though a musty odor clung to the air. Jake shrugged it off and prepared to settle in. But throughout the night, he heard strange noises, like scratching on the walls, faint voices, and the sound of someone, or something, breathing heavily beside him. When Jake woke up the next morning, the room was completely different. The furniture had aged by decades overnight. The wallpaper was peeling, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. Panicked, Jake ran to the reception desk to demand answers. The receptionist looked at him with wide eyes. "I told you, sir, there is no room 22.